and share my screen. And start the presentation. Okay, so you should be able to see the title frame here. Well, to many in the United States today, the banjo is a symbol of white rural America. But in the mid 1800s, in the hands of blackface minstrel performers, the banjo represented southern black America. And 60 years earlier, it represented Africa. So, in this program, we're going to explore how this transition occurred over the course of some 300 years and how African Americans today are reclaiming this important part of their musical heritage. Now, according to the Urban Dictionary, this is an unofficial online dictionary with just kind of some slang expressions. They define banjo player as the ultimate offensive towards redneck, ignorant racists. Contrary to past belief of cracker and honky being the most offensive words towards white people, the term banjo player implies being a redneck with all of its common stereotypes, including smoking a corncob pipe, being uneducated, having bad teeth, committing incest of no particular form, and living in a hillbilly lifestyle, belonging to a racist organization, and, of course, playing banjo. Well, in my personal experience, when talking to people outside of the folk and old time music worlds, the mention of the banjo almost inevitably elicits the response of someone referencing or even singing that famous melody played on a banjo and guitar duet from the 1972 film Deliverance. Now, the film and the soundtrack were a hit, but perhaps more than anything, the movie reinforced negative stereotypes of Appalachian people for generations to come. The locals were represented as ignorant, backward, scary, deviant, redneck hillbillies who played the banjo. Now, in the 1830s, less than 150 years before that movie, white people were imitating black people by painting their faces with burnt cork and playing the banjo. So we went from the banjo being used to mock black people to the banjo being used to mock white people. And 50 years before that, Thomas Jefferson said, referring to Africans and African Americans, the instrument proper to them is the banjar, which they brought hither from Africa. This painting, known as the Old Plantation, from around 1785, depicts African American music and dance on a South Carolina plantation, and we see the banjo being played here. So, how did we go from this to this in about 200 years? As a country, we had largely forgotten the African roots of the banjo until this unassuming librarian came along. This is Dina Epstein. And in 1955, she started researching the historical origins of the music of enslaved people. She published her findings in a book in 1977 called Sinful Tunes and Spirituals, Black Folk Music to the Civil War. And among other findings, Epstein demonstrated that the banjo emerged from the African slave tradition rather than rural white culture. And this was a revelation at the time, and it, quote, shattered myths and sparked a remarkable revival of black string band music. And her book launched a wave of scholarship that continues to this day into the history of, as Lauren Dubois' book calls it, America's African Instrument, and where, thank you, I borrowed the title of this presentation from. So we're also seeing many more African Americans playing the banjo in recent years, all part of what Rhiannon Giddens is calling a black banjo renaissance. More on that later. The story of the banjo begins in Africa. The vast majority of those who were enslaved and transported in the transatlantic slave trade were people from Central and West Africa. And there were no actual banjos in Africa. The banjo belongs to a family of instruments called plucked spike lutes, and it shares design elements and playing techniques with a family of approximately 80 West African plucked spike lutes that are ancestors to the banjo. So a lute is a stringed instrument with a neck that is distinct or separate from its body. Plucked refers to the fact that it produces sound when the strings are plucked, are struck or plucked, not bowed. And spike refers to the fact that the neck passes over or through the body of the instrument. And there's more than 80 plucked spike lutes in West Africa, among them the Akanting, Ngoni, Molo, and Gurmi. One of the most closely investigated ancestors of the banjo is the Akanting or the Ekanting that's found today in the Senegambia region of West Africa. And the Akanting is usually played in relaxed social settings, sometimes accompanied by singing, percussion, and or dancing. This and other West African plucked spike lutes are played with a techniques that's very similar to the earliest known banjo playing techniques in North America. Players use a downstroke technique in which a lead finger and thumb work in tandem to sound the strings. The lead finger, usually the index or middle finger, strikes a string or strings with a downward motion, and the thumb might pluck a string as the hand returns to starting position. So this is the same style associated with old-time banjo players from the 19th century through today, what we often call clawhammer or frailing. And this, I'm going to play a short video of Ikona Giada playing a song on the Akanting. So some of the characteristics of West African spike lutes are that the body is made from a gourd or a calabash, vegetables like a pumpkin, or carved wood, and the body is covered like a drum with an animal hide. The neck is just a plain round stick without frets, like a broomstick handle, and the strings attached to the neck directly with leather or cloth strips. So you can see these characteristics in the Akanting, the round dowel neck, the strings attached with cloth strips, and the animal hide over the body. But it's important to note that the Akanting is not the one true ancestor of the banjo. It's just an example of West African plucked spike lutes that came before. In 1502, the first African slaves came to the New World, specifically to the Caribbean. You can see here that in the 15th and 16th centuries, the vast majority of enslaved Africans were brought to the Caribbean islands where they mined precious metals, raised sugar, coffee, and tobacco. The earliest historic record of a West African plucked lute in the Caribbean comes from Cartagena de Indias, present-day Colombia's port city of Cartagena on the Caribbean Sea. In the 17th century, this was the hub of the Spanish transatlantic slave trade. And in his book from 1627, Spanish Jesuit priest Alonso de Sandoval wrote that the enslaved people, quote, have naturally happy hearts and play little guitars called banzas, played by placing the head of the guitar on the breast in a very delicate and graceful way. The early Gourd banjo is the name researchers have considered what we consider to be the first banjos, not just transplanted African instruments. The early Gourd banjo developed in the Caribbean, and the design is fundamentally West African, but it has European-inspired elements. The earliest written record of an early Gourd banjo comes from the writing of Sir Hans Sloane. Sloane was a British physician and naturalist who spent 15 months in Jamaica in the late 1680s. And he published a book in 1707, A Voyage to the Islands of Madeira, Barbados, Nevis, St. Christopher's, and Jamaica. And the book primarily cataloged plants, trees, and wildlife, but it also included this observation from Sloane's stay in Jamaica. The Negroes are much given to venery, although hard wrought, will at nights or on feast days dance and sing. Their songs are all bawdy and leading that way. They have several sorts of instruments in imitation of lutes, made of small gourds fitted with necks, strung with horsehairs, or the peeled stalks of climbing plants or withes. These instruments are sometimes made of hollowed timber covered with parchment or other skin, wetter, having a bow for its neck, the strings tied longer or shorter as they would alter their sounds. The figures of some of these instruments are hereafter engraved. And so this is his illustration. The caption, translated from Latin, refers to the two instruments in front as strumps. The coiled plant fiber pictured below is used to make their strings, and the instrument in the back is a form of harp unique to West Africa. The next known report of an early gourd banjo comes from Suriname in South America, which is considered part of the Caribbean. British-Dutch captain John Gabriel Stedman brought the Creole banya from Suriname to Holland in 1777, and it's the earliest known early gourd banjo still in existence. Current banjo researcher Pete Ross examined this instrument and determined that it was an early gourd banjo, but he couldn't reliably say how similar it is to ancestors of the modern banjo as they existed in 18th century North American colonies. And from Haiti comes what researchers have called the holy grail of early banjo research. In 1841, French abolitionist, writer, traveler, and collector Victor Schulcher brought an instrument he collected in Haiti to France, and the instrument went relatively unknown in museum collections for 160 years. But when they became aware of it, banjo researchers Pete Ross and Ulf Jagfors made a trip to Brussels to examine it. Pete Ross wrote, "As I examined the banjo, it became evident that this particular gourd banjo was the one that gave birth to the well-known banjo of the present-day United States." The earliest known image of a banjo in North America comes from South Carolina. John Rose's watercolor painting from around 1785 is generally known as The Old Plantation, and it depicts Africans or African Americans having a dance on a plantation. And this dance is reminiscent of communal social dances throughout West Africa. The ring formation is a feature of social dances found throughout the African diaspora. The instrument may have been part of a religious ceremony known as the banya pray. In some historical records, playing banya or playing banjo may have referred to the dance ritual, not the musical instrument. Before the 1790s, we almost exclusively see the banjo as part of religious or ritual dance, with only people of African descent participating. The recent book Well of Souls by Christina R. Gaddy, published in 2022, has a lot more information about the early gourd banjo's key role in Black spirituality, ritual, and rebellion. The upcoming book, Go Back and Fetch It, by Christina Gaddy and Rhiannon Giddens, is scheduled for release in September 2025, and it will have 19 examples of early Black Atlantic music accessible and playable for today's musicians. So I'm going to play a tune called Pompey Ran Away that was published in a songbook in 1782, identified as a Negro jig. It may have been transcribed from the playing of a black fiddler or banjo player. I am not sure if you can see me, because I am not seeing me, but in my practices I was seeing me. I hope you can see me and my reproduction of this gourd banjo as seen in this painting that was made by Pete Ross, the banjo builder and scholar. So this is Pompey Ran Away. Recorded clips and live performances are going to be very short, so we have time to get everything in. So the Jamaican strump, the Haitian banza, and the instrument in the old plantation all share critical design features that differentiate early gourd banjos from the known pluck spike lutes in West Africa. So the early gourd banjos have flat fretless fingerboards, whereas West African pluck spike lutes have the rounded stick neck, like a dowel or a broomstick. Early gourd banjos have wooden friction tuning pegs, like a violin, whereas the West African pluck spike lutes have the strings tied to the neck with leather or cloth strips. And there are also differences in the way the neck attaches to the body. And the fact that these features are found in 3 instruments across time and distance suggests that this particular banjo building tradition was firmly ingrained in the New World. And many characteristics of these early gourd banjos are found in the instruments built by European banjo makers in the mid-19th century, which we'll discuss in a little bit. So Pete Ross concluded, quote, "All 3 banjos differ enough from African instruments while sharing some details specific to later banjos played and made by European Americans to place them at a point in the banjo's history where it was no longer simply a relocated African instrument, but on its way to attaining the structure of the well-known antebellum 19th century banjo." Between 1736 and 1840, there are 85 documented banjo sightings in North America, according to the Banjo Sightings database, which is a thing you can Google, Banjo Sightings database. So 81 of these referenced African American musicians. Found that it was primarily a southern instrument. More than half the sightings were in the Chesapeake Bay states of Virginia, Maryland, and Delaware. The rest were widely scattered with small clumps around New Orleans and New York City. And it went by different names: Banja, Banjo, Banger, and a lot of different spellings for banjo. And these banjo sightings come in the form of journals, newspapers, drawings, paintings, and runaway slave advertisements that you can see here. And these advertisements often detail information about the missing individual, and often this includes a mention of a musical instrument that they played. Like this one says, is very fond of playing on the fiddle, though but a poor hand. So historian Robert B. Winans, editor of the book Banjo Roots and Branches, read more than 12,000 runaway slave advertisements from the 18th century. And he found reference to a total of 761 black musicians. This count didn't include singers. And the overwhelming majority of these musicians, 88.4%, played the violin or the fiddle. Winans concluded that the banjo was probably not widely played in 18th century North America, with approximately 36 fiddlers for every banjo player. From the 1840s to the 1860s, the banjo was much more common among black musicians, with half as many banjo players as fiddlers. But the banjo was starting to become popular among white musicians. A few white musicians probably learned to play banjo from black musicians in the 1700s and early 1800s, but the extent to which that happened is unknown. White people really started learning to play the banjo in great numbers with the popularity of blackface minstrel performers. Minstrelsy was America's most popular form of live entertainment from about the 1840s. And these shows were marketed as an authentic representation of African American culture, which they definitely were not, but they did include elements of black culture. Some early minstrels were apprentices to African Americans, actually learning songs and instruments like the banjo, but mockery and exaggeration took hold and came to characterize minstrelsy. The popularity of minstrelsy indicated a genuine interest in working class white Americans in the music and culture of African Americans, and it's a huge part of the story of American music and entertainment. Thomas Dartmouth Rice is considered the father of minstrelsy. Rice was an unemployed actor in 1828 when he observed a stable keeper's enslaved person singing and dancing, quote, "Every time I wheel about, I jump Jim Crow." So Rice created the Jim Crow character based on this experience, which included a costume of tattered clothing, burnt cork makeup on his face and hands, in his imitation of the song and dance he observed. He first performed it in 1828 in a New York theater. The song became a sensation and he toured the United States, even crossing the ocean to perform in London. White audiences readily accepted this stereotype of the happy-go-lucky, singing, dancing, grinning buffoon as representative of blacks. Other entertainers began corking up or blacking up and singing and dancing in imitation of Southern African Americans. In these early days, minstrelsy occurred primarily between acts and theater performances or variety shows and circuses. Jim Crow became a stock character along with his counterparts Jim Dandy and Zip Coon. Joel Walker Sweeney was the first minstrel performer to play the banjo. He learned to play from African Americans in his home state of Virginia, and he became the first superstar of the banjo, touring the United States and Europe in blackface. By 1840, other white solo banjo players in blackface became popular acts on the circus and variety show circuit. In 1843, a group called Virginia Minstrels put on the first full-length minstrel show in a New York City theater. The group included banjo, fiddle, tambourine, and bones, which became the standard instrumentation in minstrel bands. The show was so popular that many imitators emerged and started touring. In 1844, just a year after the first performance by Virginia Minstrels, a troupe called the Ethiopian Serenaders performed at the White House for President John Tyler. With the rise of minstrelsy, we see the two instruments, the banjo and the fiddle, that became essential to white country music, coming to widespread popularity and imitation of black music. Virginia Minstrels featured Billy Whitlock on banjo and Daniel Decatur Emmett, or Dan Emmett, on fiddle. Dan Emmett is credited with writing Dixie's Land or Dixie, as well as Old Dan Tucker. And Emmett first performed Old Dan Tucker at age 15 during a 4th of July celebration. And if you can see this, I'll talk about this instrument and have some pictures in case you can't see it right now, but I'm playing a reproduction of a minstrel era banjo. Came to town the other night, I heard the noise and saw the fight. Watchman was a-running round, crying, "Old Dan Tucker's come to town." So get out the way, get out the way, get out the way, Old Dan Tucker, you're too late to come to supper. So before the 1840s, banjos were homemade instruments with a gourd for a body, or calabash, but the overwhelming popularity of minstrel shows created a demand for banjos, both for performers and for people who wanted to learn to play the banjo at home. William Boucher is the earliest known commercial manufacturer of banjos. He started making banjos around 1845 from his shop in Baltimore, Maryland. Boucher created a wood frame body which was much easier to mass produce and more consistent than using gourds, because gourds are all different. He also used European drumhead technology to enable the head to be attached to the body and be tightened and loosened to control the tone of the instrument. Other banjo manufacturers came along in the 1840s and the following decades. The Dobson brothers, William A. Cole, H.C. Fairbanks, James Ashbourne, and Vega, all names that are well known to banjo collectors. They began assembling their own banjos or putting their names on banjos made by others. And by the 1850s, the banjo had become an integral part of American culture. Many minstrel songs were published and sold as sheet music, arranged for vocals and piano, which was a common instrument in American parlors. In 1855, the first banjo instructional manual was published. It's credited to Tom Briggs. He was a popular minstrel banjo player, but more than likely Frank Converse or James Buckley actually wrote the book, and they later published their own instructional books. So we call these books banjo tutors, and you can actually find PDFs of them online and recordings from them. I'm going to play a song from Briggs' banjo instructor from 1855 called Briggs' Corn Shucking Jig. So this is a list of other banjo instructional books or banjo tutors that were published between 1855 and 1887. So people at home were buying these books and these instructional manuals and learning how to play. Repertoire in these books shows the transition from fretless to fretted banjos. Frets are the little metal strips inserted into the fingerboard of a lot of stringed instruments like guitars and mandolins, and they're generally easier to play in tune than unfretted instruments like violins, violas, and cellos, but the nature of having the fixed intervals requires some compromise in intonation. Most banjos today are fretted, but a lot of players, especially old-time players, still prefer or like to play fretless banjos. So the banjo tutors also show a transition in the dominant playing technique in the second half of the 19th century. It started with the downstroke technique that we saw as the frailing clawhammer style that old-time players still play, but that was the dominant style on the West African plucked spike lutes and the early gourd banjos. But in the late 1800s, we started to see the playing technique transition to a guitar style or an up-picking style known today as classic style, which up-picking is the way Earl Scruggs and bluegrass players generally play. Between the Civil War and the turn of the 20th century, business was booming for musical instrument manufacturers of all kinds. Banjo makers and music publishers sought to elevate the banjo from its black folk roots in marketing the instrument to the burgeoning white middle class. By the end of the 19th century, the banjo was played in the parlors of genteel urban households all across America. And repertoire in the banjo tutors and recordings in the late 19th century expanded to include sentimental songs of the time, European waltzes, mazurkas, and polkas. The banjo actually became the most popular fretted instrument in America. Manufacturers started making smaller instruments with intricate pearl inlays in the neck and headstock. These are some pictures from catalogs. American Princess, popular ladies banjo. Here's some of the inlays. From the 1890s into the 1910s, ragtime was the most popular form of music in the United States. And most people today think of ragtime as piano music, Scott Joplin being the premier composer. But during its heyday in these years, 1890s to 1910s, more ragtime recordings actually featured the banjo than the piano. This was also kind of the birth of the recording industry when phonographs were becoming really popular. This is a picture of Sylvester Lewis, or Wes Osman, and he was a leading banjo player of the time and one of the most recorded artists of the period. He recorded hundreds of ragtime songs, marches, cakewalks, popular songs, and intermezzos for various disc and cylinder recording companies. We're going to hear a snippet of Wes Osman from 1906 playing Buffalo Rag. So as the banjo grew in popularity, banjo, mandolin, and guitar clubs, or BMG clubs, started springing up in the late 19th and early 20th century, especially on college campuses. They featured stringed instruments of various shapes and sizes. Here's a large group. In the second half of the 19th century, the banjo also became common in the rural South. It's quite likely that some white musicians learned to play banjo prior to the rise of minstrelsy, but there's only documented evidence of a few. Whites and blacks lived in close proximity in the Appalachian Mountains and other parts of the South, and they interacted socially and played music together for dances. Many different styles of banjo playing and songs, as well as unique tunings, arose in the mountains. Before manufactured banjos were widely available, some localities in the Appalachians developed distinctive designs for homemade banjos. In Watauga County in northwestern North Carolina, the Hicks and Glenn family started making homemade banjos in the late 1800s. And the fiddle and banjo combination became common for playing dance tunes, for step dancing, clogging, flat footing, as well as contra dance and square dance. And people started adapting Old English and Scottish ballads to the banjo. And they also made up new ballads and songs that were especially suited to the banjo. I'm going to play one here called Darling Corey or Darling Cora, that originated in the late 19th century and became a bluegrass standard in the 20th century. And I've got my mountain banjo made by a Watauga County banjo maker. Dig a hole in the meadow, let me lay pretty Cora down. From the front sounds, it looks very much like the Gourd banjo. In the 1920s, record companies started recording and releasing Southern rural music, calling it old-time music or hillbilly music. And these songs included the old British ballads and love songs, fiddle tunes, minstrel music, and religious songs from the past century. The banjo and fiddle, as well as the guitar, were central to the music. This eventually was renamed country music, but it started out with these labels. So we're going to showcase a couple of the people who were recorded in the 1920s. Samantha Bumgarner from Dillsboro, North Carolina, recorded for Columbia Records in 1924, and she was probably the first Appalachian banjo player to cut a commercial record. Charlie Poole was born in 1892 into the world of cotton mill villages in north central Piedmont of North Carolina. And he started playing in his preteen years on a banjo made from a gourd. With his band, the North Carolina Ramblers, he made many records for Columbia, and he played in a three-finger guitar style like the banjo books were teaching, and his three-finger style had a great influence on the bluegrass players who came after him. Uncle Dave Macon gained regional fame as a vaudeville performer in the early 1920s before becoming the first star of the Grand Ole Opry radio broadcast later in the decade. His polished stage presence and lively personality have made him one of the most enduring figures of early country music.
Coming up hard, way back yonder in Tennessee, the least the convicts out. They worked them in the coal mines against free labor south. Free labor rebelled against it to win it took some time. But while the lease was in effect, made them rise and shine. Whoa.
Black string bands were common from the 1700s until the 1920s and 30s. But because they didn't fit the stereotypes of what record companies were looking for in old-time or hillbilly music, they weren't given the opportunity to record, though sometimes they played in the background on records by white artists. This is the Scott family from Michigan, and we're going to hear a little bit of a recording of a black string band, Murph Gribble on banjo, Albert York on guitar, and John Lusk on fiddle. Gus Cannon was a very versatile and influential black banjo player. He recorded with Cannon's Jug Stompers for record companies' race record lines. So the race records were the equivalent of hillbilly or old-time records, but race records were blues, jazz, gospel, and southern preachers recorded by black performers and marketed to black record buyers. Cannon had been part of the early 20th century show business world of traveling musicals, medicine shows, tent shows, and minstrel shows that spread new dances and songs into remote areas. And he was a master of both the downstroke frailing style and the up-picking guitar style of banjo playing.
Lie down, and baby, let your mind roll on. Hey, walk right in, stay a little while, but daddy, you can't stay too long.
You might recognize that song. It was a hit in 1963, covered by the Rooftop Singers in the folk music revival. So all this leads us to the question, why did African Americans put the banjo down, or why did they become disassociated with it, as we have seen? So historian Tony Thomas tackles this question in the book Hidden in the Mix, The African American Presence in Country Music. People have theorized that black people stopped playing the banjo due to negative associations with minstrel shows, which seems like a logical argument, but there's no actual evidence for it. No interviews or oral histories with black musicians have revealed that to be a reason. In fact, the banjo was a common instrument in black music in the 1910s and 1920s. Jazz pioneers Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, and Jelly Roll Morton all performed and recorded with black banjo players. As popular music transitioned from ragtime to jazz in the 1910s and 1920s, the four-string tenor or plectrum banjo took over in popularity. Here's a little bit of Louis Armstrong's Gut Bucket Blues with Johnny St. Cyr on banjo.
Play that thing, Mr. St. Cyr, Lord. You know you can do it. Everybody from New Orleans can really do that thing. Hey, hey.
So the guitar gradually replaced the banjo in jazz in the 1920s and early 30s when improvements made the instrument loud enough to cut through an ensemble. Larger guitars became available as well as resonator guitars, which were louder, and then amplified guitars. Blues music became hugely popular in the 1920s, and the guitar was essential to the development of the blues. Guitars were in cities in the late 19th century and the rural South by the early 20th century. So Tony Thomas concludes that African Americans deserted the banjo because they developed new music that required new instruments like blues, jazz, swing, gospel, rhythm and blues, and rock and roll. Guitars could sustain notes longer and had a deeper bottom end, and these were both qualities that made the instrument better suited to these new musics. By the 1930s, the guitar had also become more central to old-time hillbilly recordings, as well as the new Western recordings by the Singing Cowboys. In the 1940s, Grandpa Marshall, or Grandpa Jones, became a star of the Grand Ole Opry with a comic character that reinforced stereotypes of mountain people and strengthened their association with the banjo. He actually got the name Grandpa Jones when he was only 22 years old because of his grumpiness. He later started to play up the character with costuming and jokes, and later he starred as Grandpa Jones on the TV show Hee Haw. Film, vaudeville, and comic strips and cartoons reinforced the image of the poor, toothless, barefoot, backwoods banjo players, often playing frantically and grinning wildly. In the late 1930s, mandolinist, singer, songwriter Bill Monroe formed the Bluegrass Boys. Please mute yourself. Please mute yourself. In the late 1930s, mandolinist, singer, songwriter Bill Monroe formed the Bluegrass Boys and launched bluegrass as a new genre of music. Based on the rural folk music of Appalachia, the old-time hillbilly music, but it was a much more modern music with modern jazz influences in their virtuosity and improvised solos. Now, David Stringbean Aikman played banjo with Monroe starting in 1942, and he played in the older clawhammer frailing style. Stringbean also became a regular on Hee Haw. But in 1945, Bill Monroe added guitarist Lester Flatt and banjo player Earl Scruggs to the Bluegrass Boys. And Scruggs played with a distinctive three-finger up-picking style that immediately caused a sensation at the Grand Ole Opry. His three-finger style has roots in the older parlor banjo styles, but he took it to new places. Scruggs invented the style of bluegrass banjo playing that most players have played since he came along in bluegrass, and people still call that style of playing either bluegrass style or Scruggs style. So this is a recording of Molly and Ten Brooks featuring Bill Monroe and the Bluegrass Boys with Earl Scruggs.
Run, old Molly, run, old Molly, run. Tin Brook's gonna beat you to the bright shine of the sun.
Well, early in 1948, Lester Flatt and Earl Scruggs left the Bluegrass Boys and formed their own group, the Foggy Mountain Boys, and later they performed and recorded together under the name Flatt and Scruggs. Other bluegrass banjo players followed in Scruggs' footsteps, and they also broke new ground on their own, including Don Reno, Sonny Osborne, and Bill Keith. Meanwhile, in the 1950s, some folks were getting back to the basics. In 1952, Folkways Records released Anthology of American Folk Music, which was a 6-record set of the old-time hillbilly and race records that were first released in the 1920s and 30s. Now, this was only 25 or so years later in 1952 that the anthology was released, but they sounded like ancient history. But the collection became hugely popular, especially with urban college students, and it was a big part of the inspiration of the folk music revival of the 1950s and 60s. The set featured many banjo players, including Clarence Ashley, Bascom Lamar Lunsford, and Doc Boggs. And when young fans of the anthology did the math and realized that the musicians they were hearing might still be alive, they began tracking down their favorites. And some, including Mississippi John Hurt and Clarence Ashley, got new careers playing at folk festivals and coffee houses for young audiences in the 50s and 60s. So this is a snippet of a recording of Clarence Ashley playing an Appalachian banjo song from the second half of the 19th century. Ashley recorded it in 1929, and it's part of the anthology. Now, among the groups that were inspired by the anthology was the New Lost City Ramblers, which included Tom Paley, John Cohen, and Mike Seeger, and they liked to keep true to the sounds and styles of the old-time musicians of the 1920s. And many of the older old-time musicians I know credit New Lost City Ramblers with introducing them to this style of music. Having to keep the clips real short here, running low on time. Pete Seeger was Mike Seeger's half-brother, and he brought the banjo to the top of the pop charts with his group The Weavers. They formed in 1948 and had a string of hits for Decca Records, American folk songs, and songs from around the world. Pete went on to perform with his banjo right up until his death in 2014 at the age of 94.
On top of old Smoky, all covered with snow, I lost my true lover for courting so slow.
For courting's a pleasure.
In 1948, Pete published a book called How to Play the Five-String Banjo, and countless musicians from the folk music revival learned to play from this book. And in 1954, he released an instructional record album to go with it. In 1958, the Kingston Trio released their first album, and this unlikely song, prominently featuring the banjo, became a huge hit, selling more than 3 million copies as a single.
Throughout history, there have been many songs written about the eternal triangle. This next one tells the story of a Mr. Grayson, a beautiful woman, and a condemned man named Tom Dooley. When the sun rises tomorrow, Tom Dooley must hang.
All right, you know the rest. Well, the folk music revival took a turn towards folk rock in the mid-1960s when Bob Dylan went electric and groups like the Byrds played folk songs with electric guitars instead of banjos. But in 1968, the Byrds brought it home with their album Sweetheart of the Rodeo, which was a country roots album that helped launch the country rock genre that spawned the Eagles, Nitty Gritty Dirt Band, Emmylou Harris, and others. Roger McGuinn, whose electric 12-string guitar sound defined the Byrds' earlier music, played banjo on some of the songs, as did banjo virtuoso John Hartford. That was John Hartford on the banjo there. Now, much of contemporary country music has abandoned the banjo. From the 1970s through today, the banjo's been integral to the sound for more roots-oriented country and country rock artists, including the Nitty Gritty Dirt Band, Old and in the Way featuring Jerry Garcia on banjo, the Eagles, Gillian Welch, and even Taylor Swift. Old-time music is alive and well at festivals and music camps around the world, with all generations being represented. Comedian Steve Martin, for whom the banjo seemed to be just part of his comedy act in the 70s, has proven himself to be a talented, versatile, and committed banjo player, devotee, and advocate. In 2010, he started awarding the Steve Martin Prize for Excellence in Banjo and Bluegrass to reward up-and-coming young banjo players. Popular British band Mumford & Sons formed in 2007 and featured the banjo. I don't know if they replaced their banjo player. And today you can hear almost any kind of music played on the banjo. Virtuosos like Bela Fleck have continued to extend the range of what a banjo can do. Now, since Dina Epstein published her book in 1977, Sinful Tunes and Spirituals, there's been a massive surge of interest and scholarship in the African roots of the banjo. In fact, we're in the midst of what Rhiannon Giddens is calling a black banjo renaissance. The Carolina Chocolate Drops are an old-time string band from Durham, North Carolina. The members met in November 2005 at the Black Banjo Gathering, which was a scholarly conference dedicated to studying and educating about African American banjo traditions. Their original members spent a lot of time with the revered string band elder Joe Thompson, an 86-year-old fiddler from North Carolina. Carolina Chocolate Drop's 2010 album, Genuine Negro Jig, won a Grammy Award for Best Traditional Folk Album. There's a great new documentary about them you can find online, watch for free. So the Carolina Chocolate Drops have gone their separate ways, but their members have continued performing and preaching the gospel of the banjo, including Dom Flemons, Justin Robinson, Hubby Jenkins, and Rhiannon Giddens. Giddens was awarded a MacArthur Genius Grant in 2017 for her work reclaiming African American contributions to folk and country music and bringing to light new connections between music from the past and present. In 2018, Giddens formed a band called Our Native Daughters with 3 other female black banjo players, Amethyst Kaya, Layla McCullough, and Allison Russell. They released an album called Songs of Our Native Daughters, about which Giddens said, quote, "I see this album as part of a larger movement to reclaim the black female history of this country." Beyoncé's Cowboy Carter album, which won Grammy Awards for Album of the Year and Best Country Album, features Giddens playing banjo on several tracks. Giddens also recently organized the first Biscuits and Banjos Festival, which is a music festival dedicated to the reclamation and exploration of black music, art, and culture. Other black banjo players from recent decades include Taj Mahal, Otis Taylor, and Corey Harris. Jake Blunt is an award-winning interpreter of black folk music. Initially recognized for his skill as a string band musician, Blunt has charted an unprecedented Afrofuturist course on his pilgrimage through sound archives and song collections.
Just as well to get ready, you got to die. Just as well to get ready, you got to die.
Dr. Dina Jennings is a folk musician and artisan known for creating Gourd banjos, particularly in the style and using techniques of those made by enslaved people in early Virginia. Hannah Mary's Black Banjo Reclamation Project is a group of musicians and performers employing a multitude of tactics to advance African American and Black life through the pursuance of the traditional folk music practices relating to the banjo. And their work both acknowledges and combats the colonization of the banjo through enslavement and other oppressive tactics. Lastly, I would be remiss if I did not address the rise in the 1970s of amphibious banjo players. So thank you very much to SURFA Folk Alliance International for having me. Thank you all for joining me. For more about the banjo, including a list of books that were sources for this presentation and an in-depth article about the banjo, you can visit balladofamerica.org/banjo. Ballad of America is the nonprofit I mentioned at the beginning. A lot of articles in the free music library, including this banjo article. I'm going to stop my share now, and thank you again. We'll see if anyone's left and anyone has a comment or question. Oh, hi, everyone. I'll put a link to that article in the chat. Anyone, you're welcome to turn on your camera. We're kind of out of time, but I can stay for a minute.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
Or make us, have you, I have been experimenting with Google's Notebook LM, and starting with Jake Blunt, I uploaded his master's thesis on Black banjo history, and then uploaded a whole like 50 different articles, white papers, videos from YouTube. And then I can ask it questions like an AI to probe into
Wow.
African American string band history and things like that. Have you seen that kind of tool yet?
I have not. I did it the hard way. No, I haven't. I didn't know. Yeah, I thank you. No, I didn't know
I'll
that
email
you can
you.
upload actual. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll email you separately because I can share a link to.
Yeah, thank you. No, I
that.
wasn't aware you could put your own sources in there.
Yeah, it's wild.
Very cool. Thank you. Yeah, please do. Yeah, my email I'll put in the chat too. But do check out that balladofamerica.org. The music library has a lot of resources. So was I visit? Could you see me when I was in the little screen? Because I was just seeing a couple of people's blanked out pictures. Oh, you could. Oh, that's good.
You were a little tiny, but you were there.
Yeah, we saw
Yeah.
you.
Okay.
Whoever
Good.
was looking
I was
blank.
seeing. Yeah, when I did it in practice with no one else there, I could see me. But then, with everyone else there, I saw other people and not me. All right. Well, I'm going to stop the recording.